Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. 1302. Today is Trouble in Suburban Paradise, Gender and Race in the 50s. Your hot topic words are Mother's Little Helper and the GI Bill. There's not a whole lot of them today. So last time we talked about the creation of the suburbs in the 50s. We talked about how that was made possible. We talked about the GI Bill. We talked about the creation of the expansion of the FHA, what that meant. We talked about new types of mortgages, all of those things. So that should be familiar with you. But what we didn't talk about was during this affluent time, during this time of a whole lot of economic gains, there was this whole other flip side to the decade that there are always negatives to every positive. I think we've talked about that numerous times. And so today we're going to kind of look at those a little bit. And as I explained to you in the announcement, and I hope that you got it, is I've uploaded all the videos that have links. Like I've completely embedded them into Canvas under modules. You'll see that it has the name of the lecture and then it has the name of the individual video as well. So I think the best way to go forward is to pause this video and then go back and go kind of back and forth, but that way you're not having to search for them on YouTube. We're not having to waste any more time with that. I think it's the easiest and most streamlined way to do it, and so hopefully that won't be an issue moving forward. So when you talk about the 1950s, it's a very idealized time period. A lot of people throughout the United States, and a lot of history books, and a lot of people have really looked at the 1950s with a whole lot of nostalgia. And it's thought of as just this idyllic, this perfect time in U.S. history. And it's really made popular through television. Television was a new and growing medium that was replacing radio. And with the growth of television, you have this new way that the ideal American family, and what is the ideal American family, and who are these people and what should they be, all of that is being streamed into homes through the television, through programs. There's all kinds of programs in the 50s and early 60s that you can watch that exemplify and really illustrate the ways in which the family was idealized in America, was kind of idealized, and American values were idealized. Some of these shows are the Donna Reed Show, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver. Oh, there's so many that my mind's just, but that's a lot to go on already. And so you have in this idea of this again perfect American family. You've got the patriarch who's the dad, and then you have the mom, and everyone kind of adhering to and really buying in on this whole patriarch system. And so there's this video now, you're about to pause it, and it's from a show called Father Knows Best. And you don't have to watch the whole episode. I mean, feel free to if you want, but that's not required. But even if you just watch the opening 5 or 6 minutes of this episode that's embedded into your Canvas, then you will see exactly what I'm talking about. So at this time, I want you to pause this lecture and go back and watch the Father Knows Best lecture under modules, okay? Thank you. Okay, so now you've watched it. Maybe the whole thing, maybe not. But if you watched it, then I hope that you were paying attention, because the dad represents what is at this time considered the idea male. Like he's the ideal male leading his family. He is at the head of his family. He represents, the head of the household. And then you see the wife, and the wife is a very rushed person. She seems nervous. She seems almost a little bit timid. And this is this new role that women kind of embraced during the 50s. When she was making the cake, she was trying to make a cake, and she was trying so hard, and he was so proud of her, but he teased her about it. And she, just had this kind of air of defeat about her, if that makes sense. I mean, the mother is trying. She's trying so very hard to be perfect and to be good, and she's just not quite there. And it's honestly pretty sad. And then you have the teenage daughter, and the teenage daughter is a whole can of worms in and of herself, because I mean, the body image is absolutely terrible. She's so concerned with her image. She asked something about her weight, and the dad's answer was absolutely horrifying, especially considering the fact that the daughter looked like she might be sick. She was so skinny. And yet she's convinced that she's fat, and he kind of insinuates that she might be. And so, again, all of this emphasis placed on body image for women. And if you noticed, despite all of the blackballing that's happening in Hollywood during this time, we talked about that with Joseph McCarthy, despite the Red Scare, despite all of the things that are happening politically, politics aren't mentioned. And that wasn't just in that episode. Politics were never mentioned. And they don't talk about politics. There's nothing mentioned about politics. And there's not a lot of minorities, if any at all, through these shows. I Love Lucy is a show that will be extremely controversial, because Lucy, of course, is a white woman who's married to a Cuban. And even that was considered kind of crossing the lines a little bit for its time period. And so you see very few, if any, minorities in these 50 shows. You'll notice that it was a very affluent neighborhood. All of this highlights the 1950s, but it's not showing the flip side of what's actually happening throughout the country. It's only showing that idealized apple pie, 2 kids, one dog, half a cat, whatever. That's all it's illustrating. It's not actually showing us or showing people the flip side of the 1950s. It was not very long after World War II that the Rosie the Riveter image is now replaced by this ideal housewife that you guys saw in that video clip. And again, you can watch the Donna Reed show. You can watch Leave It to Beaver, and you'll see the same kind of image of women over and over again throughout these. But during World War II, I think you guys have all seen the We Can Do It, the big powerful woman in the blue collar job who's, kind of represented how strong women are. That image just it just evaporates. It just goes away. 2 million women, in fact, left the workforce in the 1950s. After World War II, 2 million women will leave the workforce. And women now have this helpless image. This to be an ideal woman is to be helpless, and to need your spouse, your husband, your to need a man to kind of step in and help you, because you are so helpless. So it's this idea that the harder she tries, and the harder she tries so hard to do something right, that the more that happens, the cuter that she looks. You can see this everywhere in magazines and Good Housekeeping. They actually start printing checklists on how to be a good wife. I have a 1950s cookbook. I think it's Better Homes and Garden or Southern Living. I'm not sure which one at the moment, but I have a cookbook, and a friend bought it for me because it was at an estate sale, and it's very, very old, and I like very, very old things. And so she bought it for me, and I was really shocked, because it truly did have in the beginning all the different ways that you could be a great housewife, like to be a wonderful wife. And a lot of these included these these things like, when your husband, wake the kids up, feed them breakfast, do those dishes so that they're not there when your husband comes down before work, have separate breakfast ready for him, clean those dishes right away, go to the market, get fresh food, cook lunch for the kids, clean, when your husband comes in, don't burden him, don't talk to him, have a drink ready for him, have his food ready for him, don't expect him to do anything at home, praise him, make sure he's relaxed, make sure that he's living his best life, basically, while women's needs and feelings were kind of just left out. There's this new show, it's not new anymore, I guess it's like 3 years old now, I think there's 3 seasons of it, but there's this show on Amazon called The Marvelous Miss Maisel. And it's really, really good. The writers and the director of that show did a lot of research into the 50s because it's about a married woman in New York, and her whole life kind of falls apart. She finds out that her husband's cheating on her with the secretary, and she had what she thought was this wonderful, perfect life, and now she has to navigate life on her own. But what's so funny about it is in the beginning of the show, they go through her routines, and these were common routines. These were routines that were in these magazines and cookbooks on how to, how women should act. And one of the things that she does is she waits till he goes to sleep, and then she gets out of bed, goes to the bathroom, takes off her makeup, brushes her hair, washes her hair, puts on comfortable clothes, and goes back to bed. And then she wakes up before him, and she goes back in the bathroom, and she does her hair and her makeup, and puts on less comfortable nightgown, and goes and gets back in the bed, so that when he wakes up, he rolls over and he's like, oh, how do you look so beautiful all the time? But she didn't look so beautiful all the time, because that's not real. It's an image, and it's an image that women had to strive super hard to achieve in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And so what comes about is breakdowns. It's like a pressure cooker. And so much stress and pressure is put on these women during this time period that they start cracking. They start having breakdowns, and they start having all of these conditions, these mental conditions, because they cannot live up to societal pressures, and they've left their whole lives behind. They have no life. Their whole life is serving their husband, then serving their children, and there's nothing else for them. And so this takes a toll on women. And you see this company called Milltown, or this drug called Milltown, that hits the pharmacy shelves, and 36 million prescriptions for this drug are filled. And it's a drug kind of like Xanax. It's in the same sort of family. It's like a barbiturate. And 36 million prescriptions for this drug are filled during this time period. It's so rampant, and there's such a problem with it that we're at our next video, which is Mother's Little Helper. It's a song. It's one of my favorite songs. And it was written and released in the 1960s, and it was about these women who, because of the pressures of society, had cracked and were now taking these very addictive pills. And so watch that song, watch the video. Again, that's Mother's Little Helper by the Rolling Stones. It's embedded in your Canvas, so you should have no problem. And then come back to me. Okay, so of course you hear, in the song, they're making reference of she goes running to the shelter of her mother's little helper. And that's what they called it. They called it Mother's Little Helper. And so, they even kind of say that outside the door, like from the doctor's office, she takes 3 more. And that all of her life is just, it's too much. It's too much pressure. These are white middle-class women that are married, that have children. This pill is marketed as an anti-stress for these housewives. But the ads surrounding the medicine largely targeted doctors, men, and husbands. And overdosing was so prevalent that it really did lead to that song. And it led to this idea of the happy housewife. There's this stereotype that you had these really happy housewives in the 50s, but quite honestly, they were just stoned. They were just stoned because they were on all of this medicine to help calm their nerves from all of the other problems that they were experiencing. So there's that part of the 50s. And then we have to look at the color of the suburbs themselves, stepping outside of just talking about women. Suburbs are overwhelmingly white. That is not an accident. Half of all African Americans remained in poverty during this time period, and they didn't enjoy the same boom as the white middle class did that we talked about last time. Black unemployment rate is double that of whites, and all of this makes it less likely that they will own their own homes. But then you say, what about the GI Bill? Because the GI Bill, as you know, produced or gave federal funding to U.S. vets. So when we look at the GI Bill, absolutely, the GI Bill provided education benefits first and foremost. So we know that there were education benefits. But what about for African Americans? Because this is the late 1940s, 1950s, and early 60s. So this is even before the freedom or civil rights movement. So you have African Americans. There are more than 1 million African American veterans that are in the United States at this time. But it's very difficult for African Americans to get into universities. In the South, universities outright refused blacks. And the North even, though they accepted some blacks into colleges, each college generally had a pretty small quota. And once that quota was filled, they didn't accept any more black applicants. You have a few established black colleges, but they are small in number. So by 1947, there's a backlog of over 20,000 World War II black veterans who had applied for, but had applied for education benefits through the GI Bill, but could not get accepted into universities because there were not enough university slots to take them. Because the university system openly blocked African American students. And so here's the GI Bill that's greatly benefiting white veterans. So you have all of these whites coming back from World War II. You have older veterans. You have young veterans. And the white ones are overwhelmingly getting educated. And remember, we already talked about the racial wealth gap and how it was already very wide. And so here's yet another instance where minorities are left back here and whites are still running a race that's far ahead. So it's yet another time when the racial wealth gap is going to be increased. The GI Bill also offered job placement and job training, but it was decided that that would be administered and handled on a state level. So what do you think happened in southern states? There was very little help offered in southern states to black veterans. And in the South, they were largely and overwhelmingly blocked from receiving any sort of job training or job placement. There are small business loans and home loans, but we already talked about how those work. But the federal government doesn't directly supply the loan. They just insure it. So it was very difficult for African Americans to get the loans for the VA to secure. And so they weren't able to utilize that benefit very much either. Almost impossible, even with the backing of the VA, it was almost impossible for African Americans to get home loans or small business loans during this time. In fact, out of the first 67,000 VA home loans, less than 100 went to non-white veterans. So they had, if you look at the first 67,000 home loans that were issued through the VA or that the VA backed, only 100 of those 67,000 loans were to minorities. And African Americans were a little less than 20% of veterans. So they accounted for much more than they were receiving in benefits. And that is, like I said, not helping close the racial wealth gap. It is actually increasing the racial wealth gap. And then we have the added problem of redlining. The FHA is not open to all Americans because of redlining. We talked about the benefits of the FHA. We talked about how the FHA helped make it possible for Americans to own their own home. But sadly, when you look at it, it didn't help minorities because of redlining. And what that is the practice of redlining was a practice that deemed minority neighborhoods as risky investments for mortgage companies. And so what that did was upwardly mobile whites were able to move to suburbs and minorities were left in cities. So if you look at the PowerPoint presentation after this, or if you switch back and forth during it, or however you do it, if you look, there's going to be a map that illustrates this kind of practice of redlining. And so you can see that what happens is they come in and they deem these certain neighborhoods that have minorities to be bad investments. They deem them to not be good investments. And so it helps kind of keep minorities in the inner cities and allows whites to move out of the city into suburbs, and that's called the Great White Flight. And you have in Detroit, the population of Detroit declines in the 50s, but the black percentage is increasing. So the overall population of Detroit is decreasing because whites are moving out of Detroit into suburbs. But then you see the percentage of the population that is black is increasing because that's exactly what's happening there. And sadly, with these neighborhoods and the growth of suburbs, you also see what's called restrictive covenants. So whenever they're building new communities and new housing communities during this time, they would make these covenants that would get added to the clauses of the property deed. And these covenants would state that the property could never be sold to a Jew, an African American, a Hispanic, or whatever other minority. So it was a very anti-minority clause. And that was done in the North and the South. And it was deemed illegal. It was deemed legal until the late 1960s. So for many, many years, 20 to 30 years, these new neighborhoods excluded minorities, and they did so with the approval of the law behind them. And some cracks are going to begin appearing in the color line. In 1946, the NFL will desegregate. It had only become segregated in the 1930s. It only lasted about 10 years. What's interesting about this and kind of disgusting is that they desegregated in 1946, but the Washington Redskins refused to integrate until 1961. So for 15 years, the Washington Redskins continued to have a segregated organization while the rest of the NFL was desegregated. In 1947, Jackie Robinson reintegrated baseball. In 1948, Truman ordered the desegregation of U.S. forces and all the military. And so you start to see this kind of, these color lines start to crack and start to kind of break down, and that's important. There's cracks in the Democratic New Deal coalition as well. The Democrats transformed in the 30s to become more progressive, but they still relied on the Southern vote. That had cost Truman politically when he ran for re-election. Dems broke off into what's called Dixiecrats, or segregationalists, in order to oppose Truman. And then you have the beginnings of the civil rights movement in this new Cold War context that opens up a whole lot of space because the USSR uses racism as evidence of US hypocrisy. And they make it an international issue because in the USSR, especially early on, now a lot of that will change as Stalin reinstitutes a lot of kind of not progressive things, but the USSR prided itself on not being dominated by racist policies. Now, does that mean that no Russian was prejudiced or that there was this great mix of races in Russia? That's not exactly what that means, but what that does mean is that they didn't have institutionalized racism. So blacks could come to Russia and go to school at the same schools as whites. They could eat in the same places. They could exist in the same spheres, which, as we know, was not something that could happen in the United States at the time. And so different countries, the USSR, Cuba, these different places would start calling out the hypocrisy of the United States, saying you claim to be so free, yet you have an entire race of people who aren't even allowed to sit down and have dinner in a restaurant. And so that is something that is a pretty big deal. And so the U.S. tries to fight this in some weird ways, and it has some weird kind of results. So one of the things that they did is in the 1950s, they made all these Superman diversity posters and put them into school. And it's like Superman with all these different races of children. And it says, you know, very pro diversity type of things. And they place them in schools as a way to say, hey, look, we're actually extremely diverse. We don't have a problem with that here. But that's absolutely not true. And one of the things that started to kind of come out of this is because the USSR was very open to racial mixing or open to desegregation, and they didn't have any sort of Jim Crow laws. They didn't have anything like that. They didn't have a system of segregation. What starts happening is some people in the United States will say, hey, you know, race mixing integration is communist. And so with the Red Scare, that's going to have a pretty big impact on societies as well. It was also a time of anti-Semitism. There was this belief that Martin Luther King was a communist agent. I mean, truly, there's a letter. We'll talk about it more later, but the FBI actually sends Martin Luther King letters trying to talk him into killing himself. You have Strom Thurmond, who's a Supreme Court justice, and J. Edgar Hoover that are kind of fueling that anti, communist sentiment that I just spoke about. And you have the KKK that's going to be resurgent in the civil rights movement coming out to fight against it. And they started campaigning saying join the KKK if you want to fight communism, because again there's this weird association that if you're not against if you're against segregation, then you must be a communist. And so the KKK kind of runs with that idea. But then you have the Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, and it's a class action lawsuit that is brought about by the NAACP. And I feel like you guys probably know this is the Little Rock instance. There's a whole lot tied into this. So Brown versus the Board of Education says that absolutely segregation is not equal, because that's the whole thing, right? This is what the United States kept trying to say, and what the Supreme Court said is that, hey, segregation is legal as long as you have separate but equal. Many, many times the NAACP had tried to prove that separate was not equal, and they kept failing to do this. And so in 1954, you have Brown versus the Board of Education, where yet again they're going to say, hey, this isn't an equal system. This isn't a system of equality for minorities and whites. And so they had to come up with a way to prove that separate could never be equal. And the way that they did so is actually quite interesting. They had a bunch of psychologists. They did a bunch of tests. And one of the things that they did is they took dolls, like white dolls and black dolls. So, white women dolls, black women dolls, white men, white children, black children, all of that. And they brought in children of all different races. And they would ask these children very specific questions involving the dolls. So they might say, like, which doll is most beautiful? And almost without fail, whether they were black or white, every child picked the white mother doll. They would ask which father is the most successful. They would pick the white father. They would ask all of these questions. And they used this study to say, hey, look, this is what's being done to our children, and this is what they're growing up in. And so overwhelmingly, the judge decided that it was true that if you're segregating children into races and colors, then there is no way that they're ever going to see themselves as equal. And so they win the fight. And they say that they have to desegregate. But the problem is they say with all due haste. And what does all due haste mean? They say all due haste, with all deliberate speed. But that doesn't define a timeline. That doesn't, someone can say, well, I tried to do it that fast, but I just couldn't. I couldn't get it done. I tried very hard. And so it was very vague when it first came through the pipes. And so one of the most horrific events in the civil rights movement that we look at and have to talk about is Emmett Till. He made international news. There's a video here too. And I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I want you to go watch that video. Lots of videos today. Lots of great, wonderful, entertaining videos that I'm super excited about. So I hope that you like them. But Emmett Till was a young boy who was a young black boy. He lived up north, but his family, his grandparents lived in the South in Mississippi. And he was killed in August of 1955. At the end of that year, you have Rosa Parks, who's going to refuse to give up her seat on the bus, which was not spontaneous, by the way. It was planned. They had tried it before and it had failed. But in the aftermath of Brown versus the Board of Education, and in, this new Cold War context, and when you look and you have Emmett Till and you have this, it's going to get a much bigger reaction, because with the Emmett Till case, he is a young boy, a very young boy. I think he was 14. And there was a convenience store with a white woman who worked in it, and she claimed that the boy had looked at her or whistled at her or called her sweetie or did something to her. And so in the middle of the night, her husband and a bunch of white men came to his grandfather's house, took him from the house, drug him behind the car. His body was so mangled and so beaten that they couldn't identify the body. He was thrown in a river. His body was found in the river, and the way that they identified it was by a signet ring on his finger that was his ring. It's really horrific. So I want you to pause and go watch that video so that you can understand kind of the impact of what I'm talking about. So go watch that. It's the Emmett Till video. It's the second to last video on your list for today. Okay, so now that you've watched the Emmett Till video, I hope that you understand how absolutely horrific that event was. It's just shocking what happened with that. And so that made national news. That made international news. People were seeing the footage. They were seeing the clips of him in the casket, and how horrific that really was. So with that happening, with Brown versus the Board of Education, with all of this, you start to see changes. And one of those is with that Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery. African Americans were the largest percentage of the bus business. And so them not taking buses or using the busing system really did hit the bus system pretty largely. But they were able to organize a boycott through carpools, through hitchhiking, through walking, and they did it for more than a year. And so this represented a significant financial loss. And they urged the government to do away with segregation on buses. And in the midst of all of that, you see the rise of a young African American minister who is recruited by the women to head their movement. And his name is Martin Luther King Jr. And this really thrust him into the spotlight. And so you have all of this that's kind of happening at once. You have this 1954, you have the Brown versus the Board of Education in 1955, you have the murder of Emmett Till, you have Rosa Parks, you have the boycott, the bus boycott, and through all of this, you have this idea, this rising idea of what is social equality, what does it mean, and how does it happen? And what you have to understand is that in the 1950s, it was still illegal. Interracial sex and marriage were subjected to anti-miscegenation laws in the United States. And in 1958, they did a poll, and 96% of whites polled in America were opposed to interracial interactions. And we've already talked about that in class. We've already talked about the different reasons why they were so opposed to race mixing. And so in 1958, you still have 90% of white Americans polled who oppose this. And so what that leads to is something called the kissing case. And this is the last video that I want you to go and listen to. It's a pretty important one, so go listen to it and come back. Okay, so now you've listened to the kissing case, and you know how absolutely ridiculous that is. In North Carolina, there are two African American children who are accused of kissing a white girl, and they say that this is molestation. The boys are 9 years old and 7 years old. They gave a kiss on the cheek, and cops came and took the little boys to jail. They were accused of rape. They were handcuffed. They were beaten on their bodies. They were in jail for 6 or 7 days before they were even allowed to see or talk to their parents. They had to go to psychologists who told them over and over again that they should be castrated. Um, and all of that started just with a kiss. Eventually, they are charged with violating the misogynistic laws, but they are released due to a lawyer named Williams who worked for the NAACP. He's a lawyer that we'll revisit next lecture. They're never sentenced, but one of them is in jail for many, many months. And his family, as you saw from or heard from the video, his family received a lot of kind of hate and a lot of threats. Lastly, the last thing I want to talk about is this weird book. This is how crazy things were in society in 1958. There was a book called The Rabbit's Wedding in 1958 that was published. It was written by a man named Garth Williams, and it's about two rabbits who get married. One rabbit had black fur and one rabbit had white fur. Well, a lot of people in the South, and not even just in the South, but a lot of people in the United States said that this was integrationist propaganda. It was banned by Alabama. The book was burned all throughout the South. And so all over a book. And when the author was asked about it, he said, look, it's a book. He's like, I needed to make them two different colors because if the rabbits look the exact same, then it's hard to keep track of which one is which in the story. So I made them different colors. It was a kid's book. So as you can see, there was a lot of problems in the 1950s when you look at society as opposed to just wealth. When you look at wealth distribution, when you look at economics, the 50s paints this kind of idyllic picture. But then when you break it down and look at the 50s from a social standpoint, then there's a lot of cracks and there's a lot of problems that need to certainly be addressed. I hope you enjoyed the lecture today. It's one of my favorite ones. Next time we're going to talk about the freedom movement, and that is one of my absolute favorite lectures. It's a really good one. We're going to break down and talk about the early civil rights movement and probably introduce you to a whole lot of civil rights figures you didn't even know who were. And so I look forward to that. If you guys have any questions, as always, feel free to email me. We can do Zoom meetings if you want. We can do FaceTime calls if we need to, whatever we need to do to help you guys out. So don't be afraid to reach out if you need to. Other than that, I will see you at the next lecture.